Good afternoon, dear listeners. The Baobab Talk Show is back on 89.2 FM with two new hosts, myself, Khaita Sylla, and my co-host, Alioune Guindo. Alioune, welcome.
Thank you very much, Khaita.
Today, we are very pleased to welcome on our show Miss Hilary Jones, Dr. Jones.
Thank you.
Miss Jones is an associate professor of history at the University of Kentucky in the United States, where she served as the African American and Africana Studies program, and she participated in the Commonwealth Institute of Black Studies. Ms. Jones is the author of the monograph, The Métis of Senegal, Urban Life and Politics in French West Africa, published by the Indiana University Press in 2013. Ms. Jones' book examined the making of multicultural communities in Senegal's colonial capital. Her research appears in the Journal of African History, Cultural Geographies, and Slavery and Abolition. She has contributed to 6 edited volumes and 7 research books. Jones is currently working on a book manuscript about slavery, French Empire, and the practice of African diaspora through the historical links between Senegal and the French Caribbean. With the general support from Florida International University, African and African Diaspora Studies Program, the Guindo Lehman Center for the Study of Slavery, Resistance, and Abolition at Yale University, Fulbright IIE, and a National Endowment for Humanities Senior Research Fellowship from the Council of American Overseas Studies Center. Ms. Jones conducted research for the project in Martinique, France, and Senegal. Ms. Jones is a former associate editor for the Journal of West Africa History and has served on the board of directors of the West Africa Research Association, a partner of the Africa Research Center here in Dakar. Ms. Jones, thanks for being on our show. I hope I did justice to your rich experience in my presentation.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me, Alioune and Khaita, here on the show. And I should just add that the NEH Council on American Overseas Studies Center's grant that brought me to Senegal in 2020 is a partner with the West African Research Center in Fann, here directed by Dr. Ousmane Sen.
Thank you. So I see you have a lot of interest in this part of Africa, particularly in Senegal. So I'm tempted to ask you, what brought you to Senegal?
That's the best question.
And when did you come here for the first time also?
Okay. Well, I came to Senegal for the first time as a very young and maybe naive college student. I was a part of the Kalamazoo College Study Abroad program, so I will say that was in 1991. And at the time, that was the place to go if you wanted to study about Africa. And for me personally, I was very intrigued by French-speaking Africa. I had a French teacher in high school who gave us a project to study any region of the Francophone world that we wanted to that was not France. And I chose Senegal, and the first thing she said to me is, well, you can't do this project without knowing the work of Leopold Sédar Senghor. So that sort of put me on that path. And when the opportunity came for me to do a study abroad program through Kalamazoo College in Dakar at University Cheikh Anta Diop, I took the opportunity, and a group of us, about 10 American students, lived in a house in Pointe, and we enrolled at the University Cheikh Anta Diop. We spent a year from September until July of the next year, and I like to tell people now that if I remember any of my Wolof, which degna alaf tuti 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 rek, mën naa waxtaan ci alaf.
Your Wolof is very good.
If I can say that I remember anything, it was due to the teachers at Centre Baobab, ACE, including Doyen. So there's too many to name, but also Rudy Gomes, who I have to think of because he was so instrumental for so many of us, not only in giving us the foundation of language, which allowed us to get to know people, but also for teaching us about Senegalese culture and customs and how to be. And so I'm very, very grateful to him. So that's what brought me to Senegal originally. And I would probably be remiss if I did not say that everything that has happened for me since then, in terms of my career, my ability to be able to teach young people about Africa's history was due directly to the education that I received from a wide variety of professors, from Ibrahim Achub to Boubacar Bari, Penda Mbo, Joga Mbenga.
History professors.
Yes, many. I really went into the history department, and at the time, I didn't know anything, and probably wasn't a very good student, but they were very patient with me. And they gave me the chance to really explore and to affirm my interests in going deeply into the history of Senegal. Professor Mamadou Diouf, Professor Suleiman Bashir Jang. Exactly.
Both of them, actually.
Exactly. Yes, Mohamed Mbodj. I mean, all of those people were part of Babacar Fall. Boubacar Fall was part. They were all part of our program.
Good, good. And what has that experience been as a young American student who's entering into a new educational environment, different from the U.S. in many ways?
Yes. Wow. Well, I suppose the biggest difference was language. And at that time, even though I had studied French, I didn't really know how to speak or even to learn in French language. I remember I had a class with Professor Yoro Fall, who taught like ancient geographies and prehistoire. And he brought in a person to give us a presentation. And this man came, gave a presentation in Wolof, and I didn't understand anything. And I asked one of my classmates, could you help me understand or share your notes, or just, I didn't understand. And he said, it's okay. He speaks Wolof from the deep countryside. So, we didn't understand it all either. So those kinds of moments really helped me to learn that it was okay not to know everything and even to make mistakes. I've made many mistakes in greeting people, in, many things that I'm sure you take for granted because it's part of your daily lives. But I found that in general, Senegalese people to me were very understanding and welcoming. It's part of that spirit of Teranga that it was okay to make mistakes and to learn.
It's interesting how you remember all those names.
Yeah.
Professor's name.
Oh, I won't. I don't forget them. No.
After 30 years, and we can guess that you have appreciated Dakar and Senegal 30 years ago, and you are still appreciating Senegal today. A lot of people who were in Senegal 20 years ago feel that the country has changed a lot in terms socially, but also politically, economically. So, what is your assessment of Senegal then and now?
Okay. Well, I want to start by saying that my early experience in Senegal was mainly in Dakar. I visited a few regions early on, like Kaolack, Thiès. I went to Casamance very early during that time period in the early 90s. But I didn't have very much experience outside of Dakar. And at that time, Dakar felt like a much smaller city than it is today, not nearly as many people. At the time, much of the migration out of the countryside and into Dakar was starting. And so as a result, it was very easy to navigate. I will say, though, that I do remember having to, if I needed to call back home to the United States, I would get on a car rapide, yes, on the car rapide, and go to Sonatel, go to the telephone company downtown, and make the call from the telephone company. So now, cell phones have erased all of that, and the internet allows us to WhatsApp and text, and I think it has brought people into much closer contact with one another globally than was the case then for me. So I suppose that is the biggest change. I also think that Dakar always had a bit of a cosmopolitan feel to it, but I think it was mostly Dakar having been a place that is on the west coast of Africa and is a kind of gateway to so many parts of the world, whether Morocco or Mauritania or Europe to the east. There was always a sense of a cosmopolitanness. But I will say that today what I see in Dakar is all of Africa is in Dakar. You can talk to people who are from South Africa. You can talk to people from Cameroon. You can talk to people who are from Ethiopia. There's just so much here that represents the whole continent, and that's pretty impressive to me.
And yes, we can guess that that Dakar is becoming a big regional but also continental hub, which is really important for the country and its visibility internationally. But there is I know that is strongly implemented in the culture that we still prefer. Yes, we still prefer. Est-ce qu'on peut reprendre?
Il va éditer.
Okay. Yes. So we still have this. We still have this strong interest from meeting in person instead of talking on the phone. How did you manage to just to adapt to such a change when a lot of Senegalese people still think that it's better to meet in person, for example, instead of always talking on the phone or just texting?
Well, I might be a little bit Senegalese in that regard, that I prefer to meet people in person. So let me maybe answer that question by saying that even now, and I'm, as you mentioned, I'm starting on I'm into a second major project, and I often have to explain to my colleagues, to my family, to people that I know in the United States, that the work that I do, I really cannot do that from a computer in the United States. I can't even do that from France. I really have to be here on the ground, working in Senegal in order to, even though I work about the past, I research about the past, there is a way in which being able to understand that story and also interpret it and to understand the meaning behind it comes from those meetings and the face-to-face interaction. So for me, that's still very important. I think the coronavirus did change a lot of how we all do business, and we've had to adapt to using online communications and using telephones to stay in contact and to keep business flowing in ways that, and I say that for the United States too. We started to teach courses only online, and I had been doing that before, but it was a whole new adjustment to go from in-person teaching to teaching courses online. So yes.
This is really interesting. That leads me to my next question. How did you manage to keep on working during COVID here in Senegal or there in the US?
Well, how did I manage to keep on working? So one part of my work, and that's the teaching, that continues no matter what's happening. No matter what happens in the world, there are still new students who arrive at our doors and who are expecting to make progress towards their degrees. And we have the need to offer courses that are about Africa, about African diaspora, about Black studies, and so that doesn't change. And even with politics, it doesn't change. But in terms of research, that's been more challenging. I was here on the Fulbright research grant in 2020. I started in January, and I intended to be in Dakar until August, and then had to leave because of COVID. I had to leave in March. So I kind of pivoted towards reading as much materials as I could that are digitized, interviews, and one of the sources that has been really helpful to me has been Présence Africaine, which is such an institution and a treasure, one that illustrates the transnational nature of Francophone Black African intellectual work, right? It's connected people across the globe. So I've done a lot of reading in Présence Africaine, especially by some of the writers who I'm interested in learning more about. I tried to read as much as I could to prepare for this trip and to make contact with people that I had heard about or been put in contact before who I would hope to meet when I was here. So those are the kinds of adjustments I made in terms of research.
This is really interesting, and let's talk about the research part of your work. Your first book, The Métis of Senegal, looks at the prominent lives and roles of mixed race family during the colonial era and post-independence Senegal as well. What prompted you to write about this group?
Well, to go back to our conversation about my early experience here in Dakar, one of the things that stood out to me the most was the deep degree to which Senegalese are so proud and rooted in their traditions and their culture and their language and everything Senegal. And yet at the same time, it had such a long and deep encounter with the West, right? That sometimes in the U.S. we have this impression that what is modern, and I'm using that in quotes, what is modern is something that happened 50 years ago. And when you really understand the deep history of Senegal, you see that those interactions go back to the 1600s and the 1700s. And it's not just Senegal, it's much of the Atlantic coast of West Africa all the way to South Africa and Cape Town. So I was interested in understanding that rencontre, that encounter between Africa and Europe, and particularly through the lens of the descendants of the Signars. So I knew there was a lot of writing about the Signars, a good deal of, so many of the travel accounts, the European travel accounts from the 1700s and really the 1800s, depicted Signars in their accounts and in their writings. But I was interested in who came after, the families that came after. And that led me to this research project on les familles métisses du Sénégal. But I was very much situated in those families that emerged from Saint-Louis, Gorée, the Petite Côte, Rufisque.
Les quatre communes,
the
as we used to call them, yeah.
Exactly. Les originaires des quatre communes. And I was very much interested in trying to understand how that group of people used their position, which was one that was between Africa and Europe, between France and Senegal, to gain power economically, socially, in cases. There were families who were known to the nobles in Wallo or in Mauritania or in Kajor by the names that they would ascribe to the nobility, right? They saw them as their equals in a way. So how this group of people were able to wield power economically, politically, socially, but how they also lost that power, and what that looked like as we move into the period. My book is very much about the period of the 19th century, from the 1820s, even a bit before that, but up until the period of Blaise Diagne. But I was interested in who came before, and one of the sort of aspects of that that I deal with in the book is, and I should say now that the book was not so much about identity as a way of projecting oneself in the world, as opposed to a form of identification with French language, with a form of dress, but also understanding Chosanu, Chosanu, like, Chosanu and Dar, and understanding and being part of the kinship networks that extended into Mauritania, through the Fleuve, into the Peanut Basin, for example, as far as Sierra Leone. So understanding those networks. And at the same time, what I came to understand from mainly the documents that I read, but also the conversations with descendants of families who are in Senegal today and some in France, I came to understand that this relationship was one that at times pushed colonial rule further, but other times really complicated the process of colonialism for French officials. Okay. So the idea that we can sort of easily talk about people who were acting on behalf of the French and people who are resisting is just much more nuanced than that. And that's sort of where the book took me. And the one family, I'll just say this very quickly, that I think illustrates this the best is La Famille Devez, of which maybe in Senegal we know less about now, or the name is less familiar to us now. But in the 19th century, the colonial administration was quite afraid of the power that family could wield.
I know from how you described it, this group really has agency. So has this agency, was this agency extended to the rest of the coastal West Africa, or was it just limited to Senegal? And were they using this agency just for themselves, or for also the country, looking at other probably darker skinned Senegalese?
That's a good way to. That's an excellent question. Well, and I think your using of the term agency is very helpful here, because as historians, one of the things that we're really, especially historians of Africa, that we are concerned about is understanding African people not as victims of history, right? Or as those who are acted upon, but those who are part of the unfolding of the past.
Absolutely.
And so to answer your question, the networks that I'm referring to are networks that extended, as I said, from Mauritania into Sierra Leone. If we take historian Boubacar Bari's framework of Greater Senegambia seriously, which we all should, it's incredibly important for us to understand
and
Senegal.
He's originally from Guinea.
Exactly.
So, yeah,
and so could see that right away.
Absolutely.
There's a continuity across those frontiers and borders that were defined by the colonial state that made very little difference to African peoples themselves. So whether we're talking about traders, commerçants, the intermediary traders, middlemen traders, traders who traded in grain and in food products, there was a whole ecosystem in which coastal peoples were integrated into the economies of the countryside. And in so doing, you asked me the question, was it just on their behalf or was it on behalf of the country? We have to say that in terms of trade and commerce operates on the ways in which business facilitates business, right? And so individuals don't engage in trade unless there's a profit for them.
Absolutely.
Within that. One of the arguments, though, that I make in the book is that as the fortunes of the Métis in commerce began to decline, right? And so this was in the gum trade on the Senegal River, and also in the fact that they owned a great deal of property. And when France abolished slavery in 1848, those people who lived in coastal regions owned property in houses, they owned property in riverboats, they also owned property in slaves. And so they lost both their position in the intermediary trade, but also their own properties, right? Their own properties, and they weren't indemnitized for them the way that planters, so white Creole planters in Martinique or Guadeloupe, were given money, given indemnity, when slavery was over. So that created a kind of, right, a challenge. And so for many, entering into professions like law or medicine or politics became a way to make that transition. And in those roles as political figures, many of them, and again, I'm not saying all, right, but many of them, especially those who began to point out the abuses that the colonial administration was making in the interior, because they had relationships with people in Fouta, with nobles in Wallo, with nobles in Mauritania. As they began to challenge what the colonial administration was doing, the administration began to change some of the rules of who could vote and who couldn't vote, to move them out of positions of power. So I suppose the way I would answer that question is that at times, yes, there was a support and facilitation of the colonial agenda, but they were also in a position to point out the problems with it and to rely on their contacts in France. Sometime, and this is something I'm looking at right now, even with the senators who were in the National Assembly in Paris, who came from Martinique and Guadeloupe, and could speak up about what was happening in Senegal to legislatures in Paris. So that's a very long way of answering that.
No, that's very nice. And then from what you have said, you see how they have moved from being this prominent group to being dispossessed of everything, to being even invisible in present-day Senegal. Like you don't see them. You see a few of them in politics, but you don't see them in politics. Quite interesting.
Yes.
So I guess my next question is about your current research. You're working on a book manuscript about slavery, French Empire, and the practice of African diaspora through the historical links between Senegal, the Caribbean. Can you tell us more about this research?
Sure, absolutely. This is a book in progress, and it may be a book. It may be a collection of essays.
Okay.
But it started for me as a way of kind of continuing this conversation. You just talked about the way in which these families who were prominent in the early 1900s are not visible today. And yet President Senghor was quite aware of the role that they had played in the politics of the Quatre Communes during that time period. And so he was also one of the people who understood that it was important, or at least he found ways to bring them into the new national government, or the government after independence. This project for me came out of some thinking that I was doing, first about the many references to the Caribbean that I would come across in archival research. And I have to also take a moment here and say that the Archives Nationales du Sénégal is wonderful. Okay. And the director of the archives, Madame Jatta, has really been very helpful to me, as was the former director, Dr. Saliou Mbaye. Saliou Mbaye, who was the former director of the National Archives and all of their staff, because there's just so much to be understood, even from the documents. There is a anthropologist whose name is Michel Roth-Triot, who writes about Haiti. He wrote about Haiti and how the history of Haiti has been told only through one particular lens, right? And usually the lens of those who wielded power over Haiti, right? Rather than Haiti itself. And one of the things he says is that the story is to be told in the archival documents if we go and look for it. But oftentimes we have this notion that there's nothing there to know because maybe it wasn't all crafted by us, right? So this project started with the idea that we so often think about, as historians, we think about the Atlantic world, right? It's a term that historians use to describe the Atlantic littoral, that is, the places that board the Atlantic Ocean, but particularly the role of the transatlantic slave trade and the aftermath of the transatlantic slave trade. And as historians, when we talk about the Atlantic world, we often talk about it as the place from which Africans came from, but not the place that was both impacted by and influencing what was the developments that were happening in the Atlantic world. So in other words, in those treatments, oftentimes Africa and Africans become static, sort of frozen in time as ethnic groups or as people for whom we can have a certain knowledge about maybe cultural continuity, but for whom the makings of the societies are not visible to us in the literature. So I've been really interested in better understanding what the implications of the end of the Atlantic slave trade in particular, the Haitian Revolution first, the end of the Atlantic slave trade, or the end of slavery in French Empire, the politics of abolition, all of this happening in the 19th century that then comes on the eve of the era of colonial conquest for the French in West Africa and in sub-Saharan Africa more generally, and the ways in which empire then creates these circuits of migration and travel, sometimes willingly, but other times not willingly. And then, what does that mean in terms of the ways in which the generation of particularly intellectuals and artists who were engaged in a kind of anti-colonial response on the eve of World War II and then after World War II began to think about and rethink about what it would look like to create a kind of Pan-Africanism in the Francophone African diaspora context. So it's a broad and sweeping work, but beginning with an episode of people from Martinique and Guadeloupe who were deported from their islands. They were criminalized, both free people of color who were accused of inciting revolution. This is in the aftermath of the Haitian Revolution.
Toussaint Louverture.
Exactly. And but also slaves who were accused of poisoning their masters or of other kinds of poisoning their cattle, other kinds of crimes, and in punishment were deported and removed to Senegal and were made to work in Richard Toll or on Gorée, and very few traces are left, but it's still there. There are a number of different episodes in the 19th century that also help us to think about why the kind of politics of exile was something that was used by colonial regimes. I think about Cheikh Ahmadou Bamba and his period of exile in Gabon and then in Mauritania. There are others throughout the French Empire that experienced the same thing. And then in the 20th century, there is a period in which the French both use and offer Antillians the opportunity to work in the colonial service, or they recruit them into the police forces and into the military and bring them to colonies like Senegal as workers in the colonial bureaucracies and in the lower level administrations. And then, finally, I think the sort of culmination of this comes in the period of independence and the first festival, the first Festival Mondial des Arts Nègres in Dakar, which was animated in part by Haitian writers and poets, some of whom came to Senegal at Senghor's invitation because of the Duvalier regime and the oppression of intellectuals and artists, and others who came for the festival and remained and took Senegalese nationality. I think of Jacqueline Lemoine,
Gérard Chenet.
Yes. Definitely. So anyway, I could go on.
The Lemoine couple is is really famous here in Dakar because of the story. Some young people like me who are barely 30 have heard about their story with our parents. We have heard about it, and I remember that when Jacqueline's husband died, Lucien. My mom was really saddened because a lot of people of her generation really developed an emotional link to them without even knowing them or without even being in contact with them.
Yeah.
So it makes me ask you one question today. How do you see today the evolution of such a phenomenon here? Because today we have another type of foreigners that come and live here. How can we maybe define, or how can we think about what those people represent in the Senegalese or West African relationship to the Caribbeans, but also to the Americas?
Okay. Yes, I'm thinking of many things to say. So let me say just two very specific points on your question to answer your question. The first one is comes from a scholar, Brent Hayes Edwards, who wrote a book called The Practice of Diaspora. Yes, and he wrote this is a book that is about the practice of diaspora in France, and it's about the kind of meetings between intellectuals of the Pan-African Black world, but that happened in Paris.
James Baldwin.
Yes, but even going to, there were Togolese. Huvenou was there. There was René Merin, the writer and his father was an administrator, was a colonial administrator, I think governor of Gabon. So between, and of course the African American writers and intellectuals, publications even before Présence Africaine in the 1920s that brought together people from various parts of this world. Léo Fréjus from Haiti, to kind of talk through and understand these ideas. And one of the points that Brent Hayes Edwards makes in the work is that he says, our thinking about diaspora is often one that says we have to have this consciousness or this way of intention, right, that we see in order to call it a diaspora movement. But he says mostly what diaspora is a practice, and that in that practice there are meetings, but there are also misunderstandings. There are ways in which people don't understand each other and talk against each other and have conflict with one another because of the fact of our different histories.
It's not a homogeneous group.
Absolutely. We come to it from different points. But the practice of it is saying we want to create spaces that are outside of empire, outside of a colonial past, that gives us a way of moving forward or of thinking about ourselves in a collective sense, based on our own, but based on our interests, essentially, right? So I think that idea of practice of diaspora is one that kind of helps us to think through the differences, and also the people who did much of this work in the past who weren't always successful, right? Or maybe were successful in little ways, but we don't see them because they didn't create a big conference, or they weren't written about by newspapers. So I think that is the first point. And then the second point, in terms of, you were mentioning how, I think your point was how Africans and people from the Caribbean can use these linkages, right?
Yes, how they can use these linkages today to not to remind history, but also but mainly to go back to what united their ancestors before.
Okay. A kind of connection.
Yes, a connection. Yes.
And what I started thinking about is the fact that so much of this is happening now through people who are in the arts, in visual art, who are painting and doing amazing work. I think of, is it Black Rock that's here now in Dakar? We're here during this time of the Biennale, and so much of the inspiration. There's so much. There's just a lot of communication that happens across these lines. Maybe not in a political way, but musicians, artists, writers, actors. They're doing much of this work.
Absolutely.
Sure. It leads us to our next question. First of all, thank you for introducing our listeners to the practice of the diaspora. Today that we have more access to the information thanks to globalization first, but also to social media rising all around the world. Do you feel that that young people today are more and more interested in such connections?
I think that they are. It might not look like it did for me when I was a college student and, in Dakar in the 1990s. It might not look the same way. But for example, I remember one of my students, we were watching one of Beyonce's videos. I forget which one it was now. So there are going to be people who say,
that's fine.
How could you forget
How can you forget Beyonce?
But the cover of the album was taken directly from a Jibril Jotman-Betty film, Hayem.
Yes, I think it was some years ago, and it was the album, if I'm not mistaken, where you have formation and all this. Yes.
See, I knew you all would know it. But my point is that it's in our DNA. It's in the globe. It's in the world, and it's in the world in visual ways.
Absolutely.
And it's in the world in the ways in which we tell and interpret and write about history.
Absolutely.
And I think young people, especially because they're so connected with internet and social media and information travels so quickly, and that they're also very visual. That's what my students tell me. I'm a visual learner. That's something that so many young people gravitate to, that they see, they may come across this information or these images or these representations of the past, and it speaks to them, but they don't know why. And it's the investigation into why that takes them
Absolutely. And there's just a way in which arts in general, in all its forms, just have a way of conveying messages, even for us in the NGO world. Now we are looking at how we use art and culture as a vehicle for social change in our governance work. How do you use art to sensitize about corruption? So I think arts is more and more playing a major role in even the way we are viewing our society and conveying messages. Yeah, that's definitely.
Yes, but. Moreover, we also have a lot of exchanges in terms of arts, but also of intellectual production. Just to give a Senegalese example of it, Mohamed Mbougar Sarr won the famous Prix Goncourt last year. And I think that it's something amazing because it goes beyond the simple relations between African and Afro descendants to reach the whole globe, and definitions and concepts are reaching a whole other level. Let's just come back in the field of arts. We are currently having the Biennale of Arts, the 2022 edition, but also we just had some days ago the Saint Louis Jazz Festival. So have you had the chance to visit the exhibit, or did you even attend the festival? How do you feel inspired by such recurrent events that we have here in Senegal, and I think that we also have some equivalents also abroad of them in so many countries. How do you feel inspired by all this work, all this production?
Well, first, I have been doing my work diligently.
No.
But
That's a good point.
I'm so happy that my time here has sort of landed during the Biennale and the festival, the Jazz Festival in Saint Louis. And I had not had a chance to go back to Saint Louis since I was doing research for my first book, which was in 2000.
Oh,
Wow.
a long time ago.
It's a very long time ago, so there's something quite moving for me just to be back in that space.
Yes.
To see both what is the same and what has changed. So this has been an incredibly inspiring trip for both of those reasons. And I'll say a couple short things about the Biennale. I've seen some amazing exhibits, including the exhibit at Raw Material Gallery, which called Spectre of Ancestors Becoming, in which the artist Andrew Wynn, who collaborated with a group of Senegalo-Vietnamiens, created what he called a living archive through photographs, but also through capturing the oral accounts, the testimonies of these families. And it speaks to my interest in métissage and how it is such a part of the fabric of Senegalese society. I also had the chance to participate in the vernissage at the Musée de la Femme, the Henriette Bacheli Musée de la Femme, which if you have not been there, please go, because it's such a treasure. And Angélique Savané gave the opening lecture.
Oh, wow.
Wow, this is amazing.
Yes, and it's Mam Khaita?
Mahoudia Khaita.
Yes, exactly.
Mahoudia Khaita.
Houdia Khaita performed, and it just was incredibly inspiring. The artist Ariel Augry did all of these amazing pieces of women, both Senegalese women, women known and unknown, and women across the world and in the globe. And it just really reminds me how much more work there is to be done to explain the story of gender, women and gender, in Senegal's past. So, I know there are young generations of people who are ready to take on that kind of work and to do it. And that was very inspiring for me, as were two things. One, the homage to Gérard Chenet and Toubab Jalal that coincided with Haitian Flag Day, which was celebrated in Senegal by the Haitian community that is here, and it was just beautiful to see Drapeau Day, for them, and also the nature of that community, many of whom came in 2010 after the earthquake in Haiti and did their studies, and some few who stayed. And then lastly, at the Saint Louis Jazz Festival, the music was just incredible, and there was just some amazing performances that really seamlessly brought together balafon, Mauritanian woman singer who sang in that style, combined with jazz instrumentation. One of the things that I think is incredible about the kind of Biennale and the Jazz Festival is that, yes, there are equivalencies other places, but there's nothing like what Senegal does in both of these domains. Wow. Really, because it has a very uniquely Senegal-inspired influence, and and part of the off at Saint Louis included a exposition at CNRS, the old IFAN Research Center that's in Saint Louis. Amazing artists who are telling a story about Saint Louis, about the fleuve, about Mauritania, about the role of Islam and women, about the history and the presence of jazz. And there were some beautiful works inspired by Mano Dibango and Cesaria Evora, all of whom, are part of the landscape here. So I don't think you can find that any place else.
Well, let's hope we do. Let's hope we have the opportunity to go to other countries, right? Right, Khaita?
Absolutely.
Sure. And I just had a last question, because we've talked about a lot, and today, yes, gender issues are really actual. It's something that young people, both male and female, really like to take a look at, because it's important to provide equal chances to everyone, and also to value what has been brought by women and also by minorities. Do you have any plans in the future? Do you have any plans of working on it, and maybe talk about how amazing women like the ones of Nder participated in developing in making the history, simply in making the history here in Senegal, but also in Africa, in the Caribbean, or in the Americas.
Just to piggyback on Alioune's question before you answer, you mentioned the Musée de la Femme Henriette Bachelet, which I think is doing a great job in giving visibility to women and the women's struggle in Senegal. They had an exhibit called Lan Gasolon, What Were You Wearing? Where they have pictures of women in different outfits. Some were in their hijab in Mecca, some were in military outfits, some were babies, and all these women were raped. Just to tell the story about rape, and when people say blame the way women dress, blame rape on the way women dress. So I think they're doing a great work in that front. And there's a young feminist movement in Senegal, and they're having a tough time.
Yeah.
Because most of the time they think it's a Western concept.
Yes.
It came, and I think that's where what Alioune said about doing research on really gender issues in Senegal. We know most of our societies were a matriarchal society. Women had a voice, so it's both Islamic colonization, because it was a colonization, and French colonization that changed that dynamic and that broke patriarchy with it. So it will be interesting to hear your thought on that. But also, is there any prospect of doing research in that front?
Absolutely. I mean.
That's good to hear.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't say it better. I just would add on that, I think in studying African history, the newest, most, maybe I'm biased, but so much of the new research is about women and gender. And one of the things that that's so many amazing, I encourage your listeners to read more African women who are sociologists, who are philosophers. There's so many in this, I could name them, right? Just in this country, who are historians, who are literature scholars, who are journalists. Read African women, because one of the things that we learn early on is that there isn't such a thing as African feminism, and that continent-wide African women have been engaged in this debate at least since the 1960s, 70s. The Women's Museum was born in part by the women such as Annette and by Derneville, who were on the front lines and doing this kind of work very early on in the decades after independence. So I say that to say that I don't have a specific project in mind for me right now. There's a project that I want to work on about an African-American woman, Janetta Beshkol, who was the president of Spelman College, where I studied. I mean, people go, yes. But who was also an African studies student at Northwestern University, who's first research was in Liberia, and whose ancestors are the Antamajigan Njai, or
Oh, wow.
yes, or the King Anna Kingsley of the Kingsley Plantation in northern Florida. And so I think there's a fascinating story to tell there that is her
Absolutely.
biography, but is really a story of all of these linkages, and is an illustration of the ways in which women have inhabited positions of power and
Absolutely.
authority, both in the intellectual realm and in the kind of political realm,
Absolutely.
right? So, that's sort of on my mind, but I think there are so many projects that one could
Can do.
engage in. There is the women who moved into government bureaucracies after independence. That work hasn't been done yet, and for many African countries, but certainly not yet for Senegal. Women who were fighting for the right to vote in the 1940s in Saint Louis, because they thought it was unfair that
Absolutely.
French women had the right to vote, Martinican women had the right to vote, but yet the colonial authorities were telling them that they weren't really true voters, so they could not vote, right? Which goes completely against all that we know of the ways in which women participated in
Absolutely.
the political, the penchmi and the political dealings of Wolof and Lebu and Serer societies.
Absolutely.
So
So thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
We have come to the end of our show.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to us on 89.2 FM. It was a pleasure to receive Dr. Jones today. I mean, we can talk for hours.
We can.
Thank you for coming. We enjoy talking to you.
But
Thank you, Alioune.
But Khaita, can we agree that is still an ongoing debate, and that we really hope to see you again here in this talk show, so that we can discuss about so many things, because the subject is really, really wide and interesting.
it would be my pleasure.
Thank you.
Very much.